One of the reasons we're having this panel is because oftentimes what I was telling the others and what the debaters have seen and Chuck has seen is that in the current status quo, the way we engage in arguments, oftentimes people are looking down upon the use of emotion, the use of a narrative, the use of pathos in the way that Chuck described it, because people think it's manipulative, they think it's insincere, they think it's cheesy. So one of the reasons I want to have this panel and ask some questions from these experts here is to hear what they think in terms of when is it necessary, when is it help, and when can it be constructive to incorporate it into speeches? Because kind of one of the things I talked about this morning is how can we move between balancing evidence and logic and incorporating narratives, right? Especially with a topic like this, where literally lives are oftentimes at stake. When we tell you that the bomb that was dropped in Hiroshima took the skin off of 800,000 people's bodies, right? That is something that's impactful as part of a narrative. But we want to learn how can we incorporate it well, and how can we think we can use it, and maybe get some tips in terms of how to incorporate it in debate. So I would also like you to introduce yourselves. Maybe let's go down the line. Let's start with maybe Kelsey to my left. Maybe just say a little bit who you are and what your kind of background is in debate.
Hello guys, my name is Kelsey Betts. I went to the University of Denver with Gabe and we debated there in the British parliamentary style. So, sure,
You gotta
sorry.
put the microphone right in front of you.
Right in front of me. Okay, so I was saying I debated for the University of Denver for 4 years doing British parliamentary debate. So very different style than what we're doing today, but something that you can bring over a lot of aspects from, particularly when it comes to summing up at the end of debates and using those narratives and those stories to drive home your argumentation. Because Parliament, or BP as we call it, is so much more about what your argumentation is instead of necessarily bringing in and citing your evidence.
Hello, I'm Chuck McCarthy. I've been with Capital for 2 years now. I'm a club director, camp director, club teacher, also a classroom teacher. I am a high school teacher in my other life. I teach American government, AP American Government and US History 2 at Wall High School, New Jersey for 15 years.
So hi everyone. So I'm Amelia Peck. And my debate experience is a little bit more similar to Kelsey's. So I debated in the parliamentary style for 3 years and also in British parliamentary. So while it is fairly different from what we're doing today, there are a lot of commonalities, especially with the logical emphasis. I also debated in public forum on the national circuit for 3 years. So my debate experience has kind of been varied, but all of it there's the same general principles that apply to all of it, which is why this discussion is so important about pathos.
So I think before we open it up, oh wait.
We got it, Dan on
Oh, I
that.
see Dan on the end. Dan, second day. Dan, introduce yourself.
Left down. I'm Dan Austin. I'm a middle school social studies teacher in Piscataway. So I don't have any formal debate experience, but I use it a lot in my classroom. I just finished up my master's at Rutgers in international relations, so I have a pretty good grasp on this resolution. So yeah, first club season with Capital and having a blast.
Thanks, guys. So I think the first thing I want to ask before we open up to questions to the audience is maybe do you have any practical tips on how to incorporate pathos effectively into rounds? I know two of the ones I always tell my debaters. One is sincerity. So if you're coming from a point of sincerity and not duplicity, where you're bringing in emotion in a way that's effective, that judges can see that you actually believe it, I think that's something that's useful. And the second one I often tell debaters is find a common denominator. Find what's relatable to another human being and incorporate it into the round. If you have any advice in terms of how to incorporate it, what kind of examples, that would be great if anyone wants to take the mic.
Yes, one piece of advice I would give to the debaters is when you are going to put your pathos in, I would do it towards the end of your summation. You want to summarize in a way, but the last thing you should use would be the emotional. You don't want to start off your summation way with the emotional aspect. You want to end with it. And as Gabe correctly said it, I'm not going to dwell on it, that it has to be sincere, and it also has to be relatable. Human. You want to humanize your debate, because frankly, statistics can be just noise sometimes. It's just statistics. There's nothing really emotional to it. So yes, evidence is great. Yes, statistics is great. But initially, this is a people event, and this is a people, this is something that we do together. So that's one thing I would suggest. Okay. We'd like to open up to questions. If anybody has a question, please raise your hand and we will do our best to answer it about how you can interject pathos into your debate. Before I start calling on people's names I know, if you want me to do that, I can. But I know most of you in here, so eventually I'll come to you. So, anybody? No? Yes, Mr. Gazio, one of the Gazios.
All right, so this is actually something I've always wondered about, being that you're a high school teacher. How do you see a difference in students that are able to use pathos in their everyday studies as opposed to students who lack that ability? And what's the contrast between the two?
That's a great question. Especially, it's not only in you use it in debate, it's when you're writing any type of papers or essays, specifically in your classes, if you're in your English class or your social studies classes, that if you can interject the human element into your essays, that would definitely work. Now, obviously, that would be, we also refer to it in the opening as the hook. You can restate your hook, which is in the opening where you're going to introduce your case before you get into your actual contentions in your actual case. The hook is what you start off with. So if you can personalize it in one way or another, whatever your topic is, specifically in social studies, if you can draw some sort of a personal story or an anecdote or even a personal analogy, that will work perfectly.
And just to follow up in regards to younger students, let's say at the middle school level, Mr. Austin, what does that look like? Do you see the same, things? And is there a difference between the students that are able to do this at an earlier age?
Yeah, for me personally, when I look at my 8th graders writing, when they are able to use pathos in their writing, it shows to me that they've put that extra layer of thought into the topic and into the way that they frame their writing. So even if it's not completely what I'm looking for, I'll give them that credit for trying and the credit for effort. So, at your guys' age, we wouldn't be expecting that perfect example or that perfect personal touch. But honestly, it's the fact that you're willing to take that risk and make that effort, that's going to go a long way with your teachers and with the judges, because it's half the struggle is taking the risk.
Yes, Sally.
What are the benefits of using pathos instead of ethos and logos?
It depends where you use it in the debate. Logos is usually when you're on your defense. You with me?
Yeah.
When you're defending, you want to use logos because that's logically why our case is better, because you want to defend yourself, and that's where essentially where that fits into the format. That's the best way to use it. As pathos is always at the, if you want, you can use it in the beginning as well. I say your hook you should always try to humanize your topic at the beginning as well. So you can reiterate what you said in your hook, or make sure you say at the beginning and at the end. That's usually where I would say putting it. But absolutely.
So I think one of the interesting things about how debates function today is that oftentimes people use quantitative statistics to make an argument, right? Which is they'll say, the reason you should go pro is because it decreases mortality rates by 20%. But in abstract, these numbers just don't have the same impact. So I think if you contextualize impacts like that, if you find something that's big out there, something that's meaningful, and put a human story to it, like you think about what's happening in the news right now, like we see on the bottom of the CNN chronicle that 35 people died in fires in California. Now in abstract, that's something that really can't contextualize. But then you get these stories of an old couple literally hiding at the bottom of their pool, and one of the wives dying in the hands of her husband of 50 years. That has a lot of context to the story. You talk about the hundreds of thousands of not only Jews but other minorities that were slaughtered in the stories that they have in World War II. That puts context to it. So I think one of the things you have to think about is we want pathos not to act as a supplement for evidence, not to act as a supplement for logic, but to say that it can help you win arguments. It can put and ground your story into your judge's mind. It's like a tool in a toolbox. We don't just want you using a hammer and a saw. We want you to use both in conjunction. I'm not sure that's how tools work, but think about it. I think the larger point, though, is that don't be afraid to do it just because you think it looks like it's weak or that emotion by itself is something that's manipulative. If you look into the context of the round, putting stories behind some of these examples that you're bringing, I think it adds an extra punch. And like Chuck said, there's places for it. I think this kind of gets maybe my second question, which is maybe more physical ways of incorporating pathos. But for those of you that were with me this summer or before, you know that the way I describe speaking styles is like a roller coaster, which is giving a speech in terms of your tone and your speed, you have to go up and down. Now imagine if a roller coaster was just going like at this speed the whole time. You should vote for us, Judge, because we're the best team in the round. Right? That's loud, that's aggressive, that's a consistent speed. Right? That's not a fun roller coaster though, right? You're up the entire time. At the same time, if you're low the entire time and just have this kind of voice that's monotone and robotic, it seems as if you don't care. So one of the ways you should be able to incorporate pathos into the round, and I encourage you in the next 2 rounds, is how do I make myself more vocal? How do I change the variety of my tone? How do I change the speed? And that's effective. I know, at least for Kelsey, who's unfortunately seen me debate, I'm a really loud and fast debater, but I have to slow down sometimes. Otherwise, it loses its punch. You have to be able to vary that speech in a way so that there's points that there should be a pause, or maybe there should be a louder point of aggression. I think that's where you can articulate pathos well. If you mix sort of those facial elements in, as well as some of those substantive elements, I think that gives you an extra tool in the toolbox that we just haven't had. This kind of gets me to my second question for the panel, which is, pathos is a tool that's in the toolbox, but another thing we've talked about is different types of supporting evidence. So oftentimes the classic type of evidence that people use in debates is this sort of scholastic, quantitative, heavy statistics. But I think what we see in this topic, and we've seen in this format, or even British parliamentary debate, is, how do you use maybe historical examples, non-quantitative examples in RAS? Why do you think that's beneficial? If anyone wants to cover that.
So I think that's a really great question, and something that I've often told my students is you should have kind of 2 different personas in a round. So you should be both an NBC reporter or a CNN reporter, someone who's actually saying statistics and saying logical argumentation, but you should also be a political activist or an activist of any kind. So you should be appealing to people both on a statistical level, I've heard a lot, at least so far today, the 60 million lives piece of evidence. 60 million lives have been affected. So you should both say that and kind of have a quantification, but you should also kind of take a step back from just looking at quantifications and look at the bigger picture and think about what those numbers that you're reading really mean. So when I was debating, one example of a case that I used that was kind of dependent on pathos was a case that I read a first-handed account of someone who survived the Nagasaki bombings. And it was, graphic in parts, but it was a really good way to step back and kind of think about what it means to be affected by something like this. And kind of taking a step back and looking at what the implications of an action are. I know that in kind of these more ethical topics, you talk a lot about big ideas like safety or security or even war or peace, and really taking a step back and having the judge and your opponents and even yourself really think about what that means and what it means to have things like rule of law, like justice, even just a positive environment where you hadn't had one before. I think that's really important, and I think it's a good way to look at the topic on a very different level and really begin to understand some of the nuances of the arguments that everyone's making, and kind of understand it on a much deeper level. So I think pathos in that way is very helpful, both to access your judge and to access kind of the greater audience of the debate, and really kind of internally think yourself about what the implications of what you're debating are.
Okay, and to add to that, as Gabe said earlier, the numbers and statistics oftentimes get lost. They seem so distant. They're not as relatable as if you're telling a story, which you can do both through pathos and historical examples. And I've always thought debates that use pathos weaving throughout the entire debate are particularly effective, where you may just have a couple lines in the intro where you tell a story and you start building that story that you can relate back to the statistics. Then they become not just a number, but they're a story that actually makes your judges, makes your audience feel something, and it makes it more memorable for them. It makes them able to relate, oh, that story is part of this statistic, instead of just, oh, they threw these 7 different numbers at me that quantify what happened, but I can't really picture it in my mind. So you're really building something that your audience can relate to and can actually picture and see themselves involved in, instead of numbers that are so far away. And then a second point, how Gabe was talking about varying your voice and varying how you're speaking, both speed and level. You can also vary your body language as well, and that is particularly effective in how you are perceived in your debate. If you're making a bigger point or making one of your contentious points, you may step forward a little bit to emphasize that point, or you may step back during certain things. Use the room around you and use the space to create that emotive effect too, because it shows and is a way to highlight what is important without you having to scream out that it's important. Because your audience does pick up on how you're standing, what you're doing at certain times. And when you're reaching the top of the roller coaster, you should be at your most confident, pushing forward the most of yourself and the most of your own personal pathos body language-wise.
Just to piggyback on that, excellent point. I think that in some of the better summary ways I've seen is the entire body language changes when they're going towards the end, towards the pathos. To the point where this one debater had his cards in his hand and he was being very demonstrative, and then he put the cards down and said, made his voice very low, and made it very, I'm going to tell you this now. And his variation in his voice. It was well done. That's what you can use this for. Pathos is not just emotion, it's not only loud, it's also soft. It's also how you stand and how you hold your hands and what you use in your body language. It's a great example. And as I'm sure Dan would say too, as history teachers, we can't hear enough of it. History, when you use historical examples that are not necessarily quantitative examples, as Gabe correctly identified, and he was right, the debates I've heard so far about a young girl who survived the Nagasaki attack, somebody in Boston used a girl who survived a sarin gas attack in Syria. I've never heard that before. And then on the flip side of that, on the con side, they used George Washington as an example, or Ronald Reagan as a quote from Reagan, peace through strength. Speak softly and carry a big stick, Theodore Roosevelt. These are peace through strength. These are examples that the coaches or the judges will know, even though you may not know so much about it, but you know who George Washington is. You may have heard who Theodore Roosevelt is. We know who he is. We know who these are. So these are great examples that you can use as Gabe correctly identified and stated, to reinforce your cases. Emotion is not only loud. Emotion is also soft, and that's something that you should know as well.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up here a little bit. Do you have any questions or comments, or you're saying, hey, I tried to use an example in round this morning. This is the last chance. These people are going to be judging you. This is a great time to ask them about things if you do have a question. If not, I can kind of summarize some of the thoughts that we've had so far. So I think, like generally from the panel, I think we're getting this great idea that pathos would be something that should be encouraged. Think about how you can use it as a tool in the round, as a replacement for another tool. How can you use them in conjunction? How you can use them together to contextualize. Use history in a way to contextualize. Use human stories in a way to contextualize. Use your voice, soft and loud. Think about how you can incorporate some of this great feedback we've had from the panel into the next 2 rounds, and we thank you very much. I thank all the panelists for taking time out of their lunch to give some advice. Okay. Oh wait,
son.
Selen, any question?
Kind of not related, but are we power matching here?
Yes, so technically third and fourth round of power match, but because the way the computer works is it protects pro and con balance. So it says, I want to make sure that an even amount of pros and even amount of cons. Generally speaking, you should be going against people with the same record, but that's not always the case. Okay, well, pairings are published online, and rounds will start shortly. Take 1:15, right? 1:15 sharp. Okay, thank you everybody, and I hope you enjoyed your lunch. Speaking of which, can we get food?
Oh, thanks, Papa. I thought that went well. Good?
Yeah, I think it was a good one. Yeah.